In this video, I want to talk about a Buddhist argument for the non-existence of the self called the argument from control. Let me introduce some key concepts to set this argument up. First of all, remember that the Buddhist distinguishes between a self and a person. The self is what the word I refers to. It's the essential part of a person. Perhaps some parts of a person can change or can come into existence and go out of existence. But the self is supposedly the one part whose continued existence is required in order for that person to continue to exist at all. It's what holds it all together and makes it a single person. The Buddhist will argue that there is no self. So it follows that in the ultimate analysis, there are no persons either. Secondly, recall that the Buddhist is committed to the exhaustiveness claim. The exhaustiveness claim says that persons are composed only of 5 skandhas, that is, 5 bundles of parts or properties. One of these bundles consists of your physical parts and properties. That's the rupa skandha. And the other 4 bundles, the nama skandha, consist of your various mental parts and properties. Persons, according to the exhaustiveness claim, consist only of these 5 bundles and nothing more. Now, let me introduce a couple of new terms. First, the executive function. The executive function is that function whereby a person evaluates his or her own states and seeks to change those states that he or she finds unsatisfactory. So for example, if I look at my hair and think my hair is getting too long, I've got to get a haircut, that is an exercise of my executive function. Or if I think I really have an excessive problematic love for chocolate, I've got to get that under control. That is an exercise of my executive function. Second, the Buddhist is committed to the truth of the anti-reflexivity principle. And this principle says that an entity cannot operate on itself. For example, no knife can cut itself, and no finger can point at itself. You might think that there are obvious exceptions to this principle. For example, a doctor can operate on herself by removing, say, her own ingrown toenail. But the Buddhist can reply that in cases like these, what's really happening is that one part of the doctor, her hands, is operating on another part, her toe. So it's not really a counterexample. Okay, all of that is just set up for the argument from control. The argument itself is kind of long, so I've broken it up into 3 stages. The first premise says, if there is a self, then that self would have to be the part of the person that performs the executive function. The idea here is just the intuitive one that self-evaluation is performed by the self. It's your most essential part that takes stock of the other parts of your person and determines that they are inadequate in some way. The second premise is simply an implication of the exhaustiveness claim. It says that if the self is the part of the person that performs the executive function, then the self is the skandha that performs the executive function. In other words, if the self is a part of the person and the only parts of a person are these 5 skandhas, then the self has got to be one of those 5 skandhas. And because a person is composed of these bundles and the self is part of the person. So it's got to be one of them, namely the one that is responsible for the executive function. So it follows that if there is a self, then the self is a skandha that performs the executive function. Now, the next part of the argument is where the anti-reflexivity principle comes into play. Premise 4 says that if there is a skandha that performs the executive function, then it does not perform the executive function on itself, like the knife that can't cut itself. And then what follows from premise 3 and 4 is that, therefore, if there is a self, then there is one skandha that I never dislike or seek to change. That is, one skandha on which the executive function is never performed. But here's the kicker, premise 6. There is not one skandha that I never dislike or seek to change. I can and do perform the executive function on any part of my person, on all 5 of my skandhas, on my physical characteristics, and on any of my mental parts or properties. They're all fair game. So it seems to follow that therefore there is no self. None of those parts and or properties of my person that I can evaluate are themselves the thing that's doing all the evaluating. What do you make of that? Well, one objection that you might make to this argument is to the second premise. You might say that this argument proves too much. It seems to prove that I cannot evaluate my skandhas at all. But clearly I can evaluate all of my 5 skandhas. Therefore, there's got to be something that's doing the evaluating, and they can evaluate all of them. Something that's not itself a skandha, but is in fact my very self. In other words, it seems like the exhaustiveness claim can't be true, because I can't evaluate my skandhas, and it's clearly not them that's doing the evaluating. The Buddhist, however, has another explanation for how it is that we manage to evaluate all of our skandhas. This explanation is called the shifting coalitions strategy. On this account, what's going on here is that different skandhas take turns performing the executive function on each other. Do you remember how the doctor's hands can operate on the doctor's toes? The idea is that the same thing is going on here. So for example, with my physical parts and properties, I might evaluate and seek to change my mental parts and properties. And then turn around and with my mental parts and properties, I might evaluate and seek to change my physical parts and properties. On this account, there isn't one unified self that's performing the executive function on all the skandhas. Rather, when I say that I dislike something about myself, what I mean is that one part of me dislikes another part of me, just like the doctor's hands try to operate on the doctor's toes. So the opponent of the Buddhist here might say, look, this can't be right, that shifting coalition strategy thing, because then the word I wouldn't be referring to just like one single unified thing, the self, but rather it will be referring to many different things. That is, to all the parts that compose a person and that they each in turn evaluate one another. But if the word I refers to a bunch of parts, then it should have a plural referent, not a singular one. And that means that we should be using the word we instead of the word I. There isn't an I, there's just a we. But that can't be right. I'm not a we, I'm an I, a singular person. The shifting coalitions thing is crazy. The Buddhist has another move though. At this point, the Buddhist is simply going to disagree that there is a singular referent for I. The word I does, ultimately speaking, merely refer, according to the Buddhist, to a collection of parts. Sure, we talk as if each person is a singular entity, a whole that is composed of parts. But the Buddhist doesn't think that the wholes are real things at all. All that there are parts. For example, if you see a pile of rocks, you may refer to that pile as one singular thing. But in the final analysis, there's only the rocks. There's no such thing as the pile. The idea of a pile is just a useful fiction. And the word pile is just a convenient designator, a convenient name for this useful fiction. The same is true of persons. A person is just a useful fiction, a handy way of thinking and talking about something that is really just a collection of parts and properties held together by exactly nothing. This position is called Mariological reductionism. Mariology is that part of philosophy that studies the relationship of parts and wholes. And reductionism is the view that says that a whole can be totally reduced to its parts. At this point, you may be wondering, is everything that I say and think about persons simply false then, according to Buddhism? The answer is yes and no. The Buddhist wants to distinguish between conventional truth and ultimate truth. A statement is conventionally true if and only if it is acceptable to common sense and consistently leads to successful practice, successful living. So all the things that you ordinarily think and say about persons are conventionally true. Roll with that. However, a statement is ultimately true if and only if it corresponds to the facts and neither asserts nor presupposes the existence of any conceptual fictions. And our claims about persons are not ultimately true, since persons are useful fictions. That doesn't mean that the claims about persons are ultimately false. Rather, ultimately speaking, claims about persons are neither true nor false. They're meaningless. It's like if I said, Blix is the most delicious food in the world. Now, Blix is a meaningless term that I just made up. So is my claim true or false? Arguably, it's neither. It's meaningless. Now, that may raise concerns for some. For example, according to Thomas Reid, personal identity is the foundation of all my rights and obligations and all accountability, morally speaking. So, for example, what will the Buddhist make of the claim that, say, Smith deserves to get the prize because Smith won the competition? Smith is just a convenient designator that refers merely to a collection of disparate parts. And the collection of parts that won the competition is different than the collection of parts that's now going to get the prize. So the question is, how can it be just if it isn't one and the same thing that performs the action and that gets the reward? How can that be? What's the Buddhist going to say here? Well, the Buddhist reply is that it is conventionally, although not ultimately true, that the same person who performed the action should get the reward for the punishment. And conventional truth is simply good enough for the purposes of humanity. Don't worry about ultimate truth when it comes to these ordinary moral claims. Well, that raises a big question, right? Do you think that conventional truth is really sufficient to ground justice? If there are no persons, can there really be bearers of rights, obligations, and responsibility? I leave that for you to consider.